Hey students, today we're going to be talking about the Teddy Roosevelt presidency and the emergence of the progressive movement. Entering 1900, the United States was enjoying an increased population at 76 million, with nearly 1 out of 7 foreign-born. The United States would enjoy peace for 14 years prior to the First World War. During that time, the public would start to move against the barons of the 1800s and start the progressive movement. The Progressive era would echo much of the same complaints of the Greenback, Labor, and Populist Party. This movement would be accelerated forward by the Mudrakers. The title of Mudraker was given by Teddy Roosevelt, who was annoyed by the zeal of mudslinging magazines. The amalgamation of negative press, articles, and books would be known as the social gospel. This was to run contrary to Carnegie's wealth gospel. Various books were published outlining the amount of corruption in the government and by individual businessmen. One report published in 1890 that took a particular toll on the minds of Americans was Danish immigrant Jacob A. Riss's article, How the Other Half Lives. This article would influence President Roosevelt to want to make changes in the lives of everyday Americans. The social progressives would soon become political progressives. The main objective of the progressives were to return power to everyday Americans and out of the hands of corrupt politicians and businessmen. Progressives would support voters' ability to introduce policy initiatives, referendums, and the recall vote. The progressives would want to have Australian ballots to keep voters' identity secret and to curb bribery, voter suppression, and voter intimidation. Progressives would push for the increased democracy with direct voting for the Senate, who they believed only represented the interests of the wealthy. Due to the overwhelming popularity of this position, in 1913, the 17th Amendment would pass, granting the people the right to vote directly for their senators. The progressive movement would take the charge to lobby for women to have the right to vote. Women would be a bedrock for the progressive movement as they started to shift their focus on the home to society at large. Women's groups would change their focus on the ideas of the 18th and 19th century to the current era. Particularly, women would lobby for the change in factory work with children and women. In 1908, the Supreme Court would rule in Mueller v. Oregon that women were a protected class because of, quote, women's weaker bodies, placing protective measures for women and children. This would create a momentum for the change in working conditions and several other Supreme Court cases that would outline worker protections. This came with wild support after the horrendous Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire in New York, where 146 people, mostly women, would die, some jumping to their deaths to escape the flames. The progressives would turn their eye to the home as well. Women would start their campaign against alcohol and the saloons. Alcohol in the progressives' eyes was responsible for the growth of prostitution, gambling, and wife beating. In New York and San Francisco, there was a saloon for every 200 people. New York's population in 1900 was 3.4 million. Women would be so disgusted by the alcohol industry that they would start the Women's Christians Temperance Union. With nearly 1 million members, the WCTU would mobilize to make dry county laws forbidding the sale of alcohol. This would lead to the 18th Amendment in 1919 outlawing alcohol in the entire nation. Later, this would be repealed in 1933. Teddy Roosevelt was influenced by much of the progressive movement. Despite some of the annoying mudrakers, TR would introduce his square deal for capital, labor, and the public at large. The foundation of his square deal would be called the 3 C's: control of the corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. In 1902, the square deal would be challenged with the strike of about 140,000 coal miners in Pennsylvania demanding for a 20% raise. The owner of the mines would not budge and refuse to even send representatives to negotiate with the workers. After schools, factories, and hospitals started to complain loudly of the shortage of coal, TR decided to intervene. He invited the miners' representatives and the owners of the mine to the White House. Roosevelt, angered with the owners, threatened to send in American troops to the factory and force the owners into submission. The owners would relent and grant a 10% raise to the workers. This was the first instance that American bayonets would be turned on business owners instead of workers. Roosevelt would take up the fight against the hostile corporations, who he would label as bad trusts. Congress, under the direction or fear of TR, would pass the Elkins Act of 1903 that imposed heavy fines on companies, their boards, and employees that engaged in price discrimination. In 1906, Congress would pass the Hepburn Act, furthering the regulations on the railroads. Roosevelt's first major attack on bad trust was the dissolving of the Northern Securities Company that sought to monopolize railroads in the Northeast. SCOTUS would uphold TR's claims of fighting the trust and send a shiver down the spine of businessmen across the United States. Roosevelt had a nuanced approach to trust busting, though. He only went after trusts that he believed that were against the public interest. If a trust was open or created regulations then they were good trusts, they would be largely left alone. TR would lead the charge to change the quality of food in the United States as well. In 1906, Upton Sinclair would publish his book, The Jungle, outlining the revolting practices of canning factories in the food industry. Sinclair would say, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit the stomach." Roosevelt would instruct Congress to introduce the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 to ensure the quality of meat in the United States. Alright students, we're going to finish up chapter 28 the next time that we are together. Until then, please follow CDC guidelines, wash your hands, and don't touch your face, and stay inside.